Greetings and welcome back to the Old Ways Rising YouTube channel for another little project video. In this one we're going to talk about doing the carving work on this bone-handled knife. Now this is a previous project. We made the handle for this knife and this one in an earlier video talking about how to do a nice clean hidden tang knife project. Okay. The tools used are these. We talked about how to make and set these little cut-off files, right, ground to different shapes for different scribes, and how to set those in these handles, also in a previous video. The ink used is this walnut ink preserved with a little bit of rubbing alcohol, okay, and we also made this walnut ink in a previous video. Since the little thingamabobber that lets me put a card at the top of the screen will only let me put one card, I'm going to put up the bone carving playlist, which has all of those together in one spot. So if you want to jump in at the earlier videos and watch this project all the way through and then come back to this one, you can. So if you want to jump right into this video, a little bit about the carving. I like to carve beaver patterns into a lot of my woodworking tools, like Beaver's First Woodworker. It's a fun thing. And I also like to play the mental game of, I have a form which has to be a certain way because it has to fit my hand. Okay? So there is very little flexibility in what this handle needs to be, right? It needs to be a good, useful, whittling grip. It needs to be good, comfortable for a pinch grip if I'm using it to skin something. For an all-around camp blade, you need to be able to hold it multiple ways. So you don't want exuberant finger grooves, you don't want finger loops, you don't want exaggerated curves, because anytime you do that, it says you must hold it exactly this way, and the tool has one purpose. Okay? This is a multi-tool. So I want to have that flexibility of a simple straight handle, which looks nothing like a beaver. So in order to carve a beaver pattern into it, you have to get a little bit creative. So for here, I've represented the beaver with a beaver tail, okay? And then I have the hind paws of the beaver in the end of the knife, and the front paws of the beaver as though it was walking and making these footprints to represent that. So this is the project. If you're interested in seeing how we carve these patterns into this knife handle, come along. I'm going to carve and ornament this bone handle, and this is a little prototype and kind of a concept drawing in 3D for what I'm going for. Now, this is part of a larger project. I'm working on producing a set of, a toolbox full of basic woodworking tools, all carved with the theme of beavers and woodpeckers as nature's first woodworkers, right? That's the concept. A fun little project. So this is going to get a beaver design. Now, I can't literally carve a beaver to this handle, right? It won't work. It is the wrong shape. And I think this is a fun challenge. I enjoy this challenge. I enjoy finding natural ergonomic shapes and natural materials and then working them into tools. And I also enjoy ornamenting things where the nature of the ornamentation is dictated by the ergonomic needs of the object I'm working with, right? Rather than just picking, oh, I'm going to carve a fill in the blank. It's, I have a thing which has to be a comfortable shape for my hand to hold. How do I decorate it in a way which carries the meaning I want to put into the decoration, but does not in any way compromise the ergonomics of the final object? Now, there's a couple art traditions that really do this well, right? That take representative art and do it in a somewhat abstracted way so that the meaning of the representation comes through but fits whatever form it's forced into. And the two that I've really enjoyed studying are Egyptian art and form line art from the Pacific Northwest. Okay, Egyptian art is really interesting. There's a lot of counting and meaning and substantive content that is put forth into the designs, but in a highly abstracted way, right? So if you'll have like a hunter who harvested 10 geese on a certain hunt, and you have like a goose with like 10 heads fanning out across it, right? And they're not drawing a 9-headed goose, they're drawing 10 geese in the most compact form possible, right? It's really interesting to dig into and look at what they're doing with that. And then in the Pacific Northwest, the form line work, there's formalized ways of representing a critter, but then those are forced into shapes, forced into tool handles, the prow of a canoe, the curve of a door, right? They're forced into these forms. And so the animal, the meaning that we're trying to depict this animal is conveyed in a way which just completely obliterates the anatomical structure of the animal, but still has that meaning conveyed. And it's really neat how they do that. And I'm going to be inspired a little bit by that. Now, this sort of form line artwork in contorted shapes you can see in this book. For copyright reasons, I can't go into it and show a whole bunch of pictures within here, but I think I can show the cover safely. So, you have a critter that is twisted into this circle, okay? Very non-anatomical. Pretty sure it's a raven, but it's being forced to conform to an object, okay? Now, when we're studying and being inspired by world cultures, it's important to make sure that we're not unduly misappropriating anything which is close practice. So as I was studying this, the SeAlaska Institute does a lot of work with Alaska Native cultures, has a lot of talks by Alaskan Native individuals. And in one of those talks, there was an elder woman talking about form line and its history and its place. And it's a traded art form that was always traded back and forth between multiple tribes. The general concept behind form line isn't close practice, but specific motifs within it are. Okay? So when she was talking about this, she said, we want people to play with and work with and understand and appreciate our art form because it's a rich tradition. It's not in and of itself entirely a close practice, but there are specific clan crests and clan emblems that are only belonging to that clan, and to appropriate those is wrong. So I'm working with that.
Nuance is a thing.
Nuance is a thing. Nuance is everything, right? Nuance isn't just a thing. Nuance is everything. So based on that, it's okay to learn some things from this tradition, but it's also important that when you are designing a piece inspired by this art form, that you're designing your own piece and not just going to a museum and directly copying something that you see in some museum piece, because then you don't know whether that's a clan crest or not. Okay? That's bad. Don't do that. But it's okay to learn from it and learn the concepts. And studying the form line representation of beaver. Oh, I will put a link to SeAlaska Institute down in the description box. They have a ton of wonderful videos on this art form and its place in culture and how it's executed and whatnot. So in studying the form line representation of beavers, there's a couple of key things that indicate that this is a beaver being represented. And it's the tail and the face with the big buck teeth. Okay, and often the big buck teeth are attached to a stick and then it has two paws holding the chewing stick. Okay, so that, and it can be drawn any way, but if you have any kind of face, it can be a human face with big buck teeth chewing on a stick, and that still means beaver.
That's cute.
Because of the action, right? The identity is in the action. I don't have room on this to do that. But then with the tail, you always have the tail with some sort of crosshatch pattern, And then if you look at a beaver, there's a big junction, a big knot at the base of the tail that is part of the furred component of the animal. And that joint would be represented with an ovoid or a U shape, often further ornamented with a human face in the tail joint. Okay? So that's how they do it. Now, in my mind, the identity of an animal that you can't fully see is in its tracks. Okay? Now, in form line, paws are very, very abstract, right? You don't have a literal track shape. It's very, very abstract. But I want literal paws, especially the hind feet, which are distinct from any other track in North America. So for my representation of a beaver, partially but not entirely informed by the form line, I have the tail, and I do have a form line U shape here as the joint. But then I'm doing very literal beaver hind feet here at the base of the knife handle. So that's my learning from this tradition, but doing my own thing at the same time. Okay, so I hope if anybody here is from one of the Pacific Northwest cultures and wants to chime in and tell me if I'm doing this right or wrong. If I'm doing it wrong, I'm certainly open to learning that as well. But this is my concept for the handle ornamentation. Okay. I also have the idea of doing some front paws here in this space, right where the blade attaches. But I'm not sure if I'm going to have space to do that because my actual bone knife handle is quite a bit slimmer in that region than this little quick and dirty wooden mock-up, right? So we'll see. We'll hold that idea loosely. The hind paw is what's most distinctive about the track of a beaver, okay? So now, the next thing I need to do here is to finish carving this. And when I made this mock-up, I made this really pointy here at the base, and I don't really like that, so I'm going to make it much more rounded in the actual piece. Okay, so I'm going to take Mr. File, and we're going to do a whole bunch of work. Okay, filing that down, rounding it off, and then a whole lot of boring work sanding this down to 220 grit so that I can draw on it accurately. Once I'm done with that, we'll talk about, we'll draw this pattern and talk about the approach to carving the design. Here's where we are after rounding everything off. So like I said, I left this end a little bit more blunt and just made it comfortable in the hand, basically, right? Just rounded off the corners, made it comfortable in the hand. Then I've also started sketching this beaver tail pattern, and that's the D shape with, you know, sort of a form line-ish D shape ovoid kind of thing there for the tail joint, the tail itself, and then literal hind paws. Okay? Now, the problem with doodling on bone is that the pencil marks smudge very, very easily. So we need to make these outlines a little bit more permanent. And we're going to do that by taking our little scribe and scratching them. Okay. Now we don't need a really deep scratch. We just need an indication. And then when we ink this, that will make a line that will not smudge and will leave this pattern on. Now this doesn't need to be perfect because this is going to be a relief carving. So none of these initial lines are going to show in the final piece. So we just need this to be deep enough and indelible enough that we can ink it, have the lines stay while we're carving. So here we have scratched in all of the lines that I had drawn, but you can see pretty clearly there's not a whole lot to see. Everything's smudged to gone. But on this side, we can see the lines, and that's because I have inked this side, but not the other. So what I'm doing here is I'm using our batch of walnut ink, walnut dye that was used in a previous video. And I did add a few drops of dish soap to it, simply because the bone is a little bit oily, and as I was tinkering with this, there were a few spots where it was kind of resisting. So we're just going to take this, rub it in well. Okay. Rub it in well. And then ideally, let it dry for a few minutes. Now, I don't want to sit and have you literally watch paint dry, so I'm going to wipe this off right away. But even with that, sort of a half-baked version, you can start to see the lines showing up. Okay? So this is the goal. Now, you won't... This is not an impressive carving, and it doesn't need to be. I just need marks that I'm able to see and follow for future steps. We're going to do relief carving on here. I just need a mark that won't smudge. So this light, this light mark is good enough for what I'm doing. You can also see that this dye is going to stain the bone, okay? And that's okay. We're going to work with that as we go through. But you do want to know that with an untreated bone using walnut stain, it is going to, change the bone to sort of a buff color, okay? You'll see how I work with that as we go along, and it's just fine, but you do need to know that it's there. And then thirdly, if you look at this section here, you can see there's a lot of dark speckles. Those are little spots where blood vessels and or nerves have penetrated into the bone, and that's normal for bone. That's the big difference between bone and ivory, is that bone has this and ivory doesn't. So again, I always talk about using these natural materials and traditional techniques by saying that if you're doing this, if you're choosing to do these things this way, you're choosing character. So I'm totally fine with that. It's just a feature of the material, and I consider it a feature, not a bug. So I'm going to go ink this up and get this dark, and if there's any spots here where it's hard to see, I will re-scratch those. And then I'll decide, I think I have enough room here to play with the small paw print. I'll just sketch a couple of things, and you'll know what I decided later on when we start carving. We are actually ready to start the carving process on this. Now, this is a nice scratch pattern and a nice faint brown line across the whole surface, marking all of the what will be the positive space, and then in between will be removed as background. It might be a little bit difficult to see on the camera. It's, again, in some of these things, there's so much more that you get in person than what is possible to record on film. But you should be able to see at least the generalities of the design there. I did sketch in some front paws here and there, but it's a little bit out of scale. They're a little bit small relative to the hind paws at the back. We'll see if I like them. If I get into this and I decide I don't like it, I can always just carve it off, right? And just flatten it off and omit that part. So we'll see how that develops. Now, we're ready to actually start some of the relief carving. And on this side, as well as here, I've started the process of removing some of the background. So the paws and the tail are going to be positive space that pops forward. Everything else will be background and sink away. The tool that I'm using to do that is this little flat chisel. Okay. Now, the process is simple but a bit slow. So I'm going to do it here in this large space that doesn't have any carving in it. And you just want to go systematically, start at a line with the tool edge right at that line. Then you want to come up to around a 45-degree angle to the work. Press in hard and then start rocking the tool back and forth. Okay? Now, the more you tilt the tool up, the deeper you dig in. The more you lean it down, the faster it advances forward. So that's how you control your depth of cut. Okay? You can see right there the white is showing through where I've removed an area of surface. So you just kind of have to feel this, decide how much you want to remove, and get a consistent angle, and then keep doing it. If your tool wants to dig in a little too much, you flatten it out. If it's just skating across the surface and not removing these nice little shreds that you see there, then tilt it up more. Okay? And then you'll go and you'll make another line at the same angle and degree of pressure. And then another line at the same angle and degree of pressure. There it wanted to dig in a little bit, so stop and lower the angle at that spot. Okay? Now, after you cover a whole area, then you'll want to look at it closely, see if there's any obvious highs and lows. Because again, bone can have hard spots and soft spots. One thing I've noticed about this particular piece when I was working here on the edge is this middle slip of bone is much harder than the top and the bottom. And there are some soft spots in the side scales where the tool is wanting to dig in a lot and I have to flatten out quite a bit, and then I'll get to a hard spot and have to pick it up. So you just adjust. Then if we see a spot where there was a harder spot and we left it, like right here, there's a harder spot. So I'll come in the opposite direction and just remove another little layer of shavings. Okay? So that looks relatively flat. And then we're going to take this triangular scraper scribe, and just as though we were carving with a wood carving knife, flatten that surface. Okay? And then turn it, flatten the back there. And then as we're doing this, you'll really be able to see if there's any highs or lows. Even more so than when you're digging in and you have that rough, erratic texture. Now, each pass is only going to remove a fairly small amount of bone. Right? Well, we can cover the surface pretty efficiently, but we're only removing small bits of bone. So we're going to need to do 2 or 3, probably 3 passes. So here in this area where I've already worked, I want to take another pass, but I want to make sure that we're removing consistent, even thickness passes. That's very, very important for this sort of relief carving. Now, to do that, we're going to remove a surface, and once the surface is removed and we verified it's flat, we stop. To mark the next surface, we're going to cover this in some sort of ink. And you could do this with the same ink that I used to darken those scratch lines. Or we can just color an area with a Sharpie. And then, when we come back through on this area that's colored in, we start taking our next pass. You can see very easily and obviously where you've worked and where you haven't. So it's not important what you use to do this coloring. It can be ink, can be Sharpie, can even be pencil, could even be charcoal, could be an oil pastel. Don't care. What's important is that we have a clear way to know where we've been, where we haven't been, and that we're carving down a flat, even surface in each pass. The coarse backgrounding is complete. So these areas here are carved back. The edge along the little beaver tail patterns is carved back. I ended up doing 2 passes. I wanted about a shy millimeter of material removed, and I got that with 2 passes, so I'm happy with that. Now, I'm only doing 1 pass here in the front, because if you look at the profile of this, it's already thin, and I don't want to thin that out more than I need to. So it will be a little deeper in the back and a little shallower in the front. And that's okay. As long as you keep an even gradient, it will still look nice. Now, the next thing we need to do is we've removed the majority of the background in the coarsest possible way. There's still a lot of work to do. It's still rather messy looking. Okay, so before we go farther and do detail carving on the tail and on these feet, we want to clean it all up. And we're going to do that with this V-graver here. So the next step in this process is going to be to take this and cut in a line adjacent to all of the positive features. Okay? And just do this in little bits. Don't try to get too carried away. And if the grain starts fighting you, flip it and carve in the other direction. Okay? Bone does have a grain. Just like wood has a grain, bone has a grain. It's different than wood grain, though. It's not as pronounced, and it spirals along the side of the bone. It doesn't, let me rephrase that. It does go vertically with the bone in its largest degree of motion, but it more closely follows the blood vessels and where they penetrate and move around the bone. So, you know, if you have your arm bone, the grain isn't perfectly perpendicular. It's kind of up and around like that. Okay? So when we have these flat pieces, we're going to be with the grain sometimes and against it sometimes. And if you feel your tool digging in, just like with a wood carving, stop, flip it, go the other direction. Okay? And we're going to use the side of this V tool as a scraper. So I've already cut that V as deep as I want, but now I'm scraping the positive side vertical. Okay? I want a nice vertical edge here. Square, octagon, round still applies. Okay? So I want, while I'm outlining and cleaning up these little foot patterns, I want a vertical edge to the positive space. But then where we're moving toward the negative space, what's been carved back, the background, I'm going to take it and also use the side of this V tool as a scraper and ease it in to what I've already relieved. Okay? Just like that. Okay? Just do it little bits at a time. If you try to say, oh, I'm going to plow this whole line, you'll do well, then you'll start to, your tool's going to want to start to tip up, then you're going to overforce, and as soon as you start overforcing, you're going to slip and get a big old gash somewhere you don't want it. But hopefully it's picking up well enough for you to see that this line here is a lot cleaner than what's behind it that I haven't worked on. So that's going to be the next process, going around all 4 little footprints and around the tail pattern, finishing the backgrounding, and this is going to be a finished surface. Unless I screw up and gash it and have to clean something up, this is going to be, these tool marks will be the last thing that happens to this surface. I don't want to come back with sandpaper because it's going to look different and artificial compared to the rest of the surfaces, right? So I want good, clean, even, consistent tool marks in all of these background areas, okay? So that's the goal there. And then, when I've done that, I'm also going to come and carve in a little bit deeper into this hatching pattern on the beaver tail itself. Okay? We're going to have to round this off and I need to take these shallow, sketchy scratches, right? I was just sketching here initially, and I need to deepen them to actual grooves, okay? That way when I round this off, I will still be able to see where they are and finish up this pattern. Thirdly, another note of caution, I have epoxy lines in here. Now, if you're used to wood carving, your glue lines are hard spots, and they're annoying because they're hard spots. Here, epoxy is substantially softer than the bone that it's gluing together. So, right in a few areas along the side of these beaver tail patterns, where the groove is going to go down a glue line, you got to be real ginger and careful with that, or you can just gouge massively deep chunks of glue out of those grooves. Okay, because it's only about half as hard as the bone. So you'll get used to using a certain amount of pressure to cut the bone, and then you get into here to those glue lines, and you can just tear stuff up. Now, yes, it's fixable. I could go back, I could mix a little batch of epoxy, I could put a little in there and scrape it back down and clean it up. It's absolutely repairable. If I mess up on that, I'm not throwing away the project, not at this stage. I will fix it. But I don't want to have to. I have this at a couple of different stages to talk about the various processes in a little bit more detail. So on this side, I have carved in all of the basic lines. Okay, I've cut in all of the background. I've done a little bit of rounding, but not all of it. On this side, I've cut in all of the background around the footprints, but I haven't done any of the basic lines on the beaver tail. Okay, so doing the backgrounding is, you know, just more of the same, cutting in, cutting it around them, carving out the material, and that is one of the really big time investments. And then cutting in all of these lines is also a really big time investment. The rounding and finishing goes fairly quickly once you've done all of that. Okay, so when you get all of this, all of the mass removal done in a project like this, you're on the home stretch. So you just have to keep patient and keep doing it. Now, I want to talk specifically about cutting in these lines, and I'm going to do a little bit here. And the two key things are going slow and using all of your tools. So as I'm going along one of these lines, I'm going to dig a little bit with the V tool and then rock it up. And then again, dig a little bit and then rock it up. And then dig down a little bit and rock it up. And what I'm doing is I'm going from flat to having a groove. And then as I'm rocking up, okay, I'm carving, I'm whittling the groove further and further and further down the piece. Okay. If you just try to, you know, on a piece of wood like this, I can dig in and then just kind of cut a nice long ribbon of wood out like that. Right, there it is. Wood is soft. Bone is not soft. If you try to do that, dig in and then run the line long, you will slip out and get a scratch where you don't want it. So again, we come back to our piece, we dig in to start it, and then walk it up, and each time you do this, you're walking that groove a little bit farther along. Okay? And the other thing is when you come and you're lifting up, if you slip a little bit, like here, I'll do it on purpose, or if you slip a little bit and it pops, because you're lifting up at the end of your cut, it pops away from your piece and you don't get that scratch. Okay? And you can see there's the little bit of line that I started making. Now, it can be difficult when we get down to the edge and we're going down the line. Here, when I'm cutting downhill, I'm cutting toward material that's already finished. If I get a shallow scratch in here, yes, I can just come and I can, shave back a little bit of material and rectify the situation. If I get a deep scratch, it will hold ink at the end of the day and will be a permanent thing. Now, a casual person observing it might not even notice that, but you, as the craftsperson who made it, will know that there's a scratch where you did not intend there to be a scratch, and it will annoy you. So we don't want to do that. Using all our tools. A handy tool to use in tight corners like that is this square chisel. So you're not going to use it to run along a long line. It's not the right tool for that. But when I get down to these corners, I can put it right adjacent to that, cut down, and then cut down from both sides. Okay. And make a little notch there. And then I only have to run my line to the end of that notch. And I don't have to go all the way down to here. Or, depending on how you're holding your piece and where it's comfortable to hold it, I can start at the bottom and come up into that and make a notch that way, and then again run into it from the other direction. I have done both of these on this. It's however, which is better? Whichever's easier to hold. Okay, whichever's easier to hold. So that's cutting those lines. Next, rounding things off. That is our triangular scraper. Okay, and this is very, very simple process, very easy to understand. I'm going to pick a line segment, and I'm trying to do this so it's not casting too much shadow on the film here. And just scrape with the edges. Just scrape it round. Okay? Very, very simple concept. Okay? And you're just going to work around. What you don't really want to do is scrape a whole line at once and go tick, 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 tick across all of these grooves, because you'll end up chipping corners. Again, at the end of the day, if you hand this to somebody and say, hey, look at this little thingamabobber I made, they're probably not going to notice, but you're going to know where you chipped the corner, and it's going to annoy you. So don't annoy yourself. Just work one little segment at a time. It goes fairly quickly. That's the second thing I want to talk about here. Third thing I want to talk about is how we're going to do the webbing in these hind feet. You can see, like right here is the edge of a toe. Right here is the edge of a toe. Okay.
Your knuckle is in the way. I
Sorry.
can't see anything.
Right here and right there.
There we go.
Okay. Now, when we're doing a relief carving, you want to think in layers. Any kind of relief carving. I even do this with some round form carvings that's kind of flattened out of shape. So think in layers. There's always at least 2 layers or you don't have a relief carving. A shallow relief carving is going to usually have 3, maybe 4. Okay. And then deep relief is going to have 4, 5, 6 layers. You can have as many layers as you want. Okay. Layer 1 is always going to be the original surface of your piece, right? So this is layer 1. I'm going to have 3 layers in this foot. The background is going to be layer 3, right? So 1 to N, layer N always being the background that you removed, layer 1 always being the surface, and then stepping down through. So you want to think about what your layers are going to be. The foot pads are going to be 1. The webbing is going to be 2. Okay, and background is 3. Now, at the edge, the webbing will fade into 3. Okay? And the toes, where the claws come down, 1 will fade all the way down to 3. Okay? So, we did 2 deep cuts with the chisel here in the background. I'm just going to do 1 here in this webbing, and it's going to be the same process with the rock cut. And cut from line to line. Okay. And I'm going to stop a little bit short of the back line. Now, when I was cutting away the background, I came back with the corner chisel and made a really sharp demarcation because I want to see clearly what's carving and what's background. But if you look at a beaver's foot, this webbing is pretty thick, and the toes are pretty thin by critter toe pad standards. So there's not a huge distinction. So we're not going to cut that in too sharp. There you can see where it's whiter. Then I'm going to scrape that. Okay. I know this is white on white. I was setting this up so that there would be some shadow, so that hopefully you can see some of the pattern. Fortunately, it's also putting shadows where I don't necessarily want them. Again, use all the tools. Some places it's going to be easier to scrape with this. Okay. Now, I will systematically go around and do that to all of those webbings, but then when I'm done, remember this fades to 3, so that edge I will relieve. Okay. Now, obviously that needs a lot more work, but you can see the whole process. And after I get those done, then we're going to scrape these edges to round. And here where the fingers come down, we'll scrape that in a nice even fade, with one fading all the way to 3. And that will end up giving us our final toe pattern. We are finished carving and about ready to look at the inking and do a final reveal. Right before I do that, I just want to quickly mention that this is an unmonetized and unsponsored YouTube channel, but we have a Patreon. So if you are interested in this kind of content, enjoy these projects, and want to keep it free and ad-free, go check out our Patreon. We are so grateful for the patrons that we already have, and there's a lot in it for you too. The Patreon store is full of digital downloads, all sorts of information resources, plans and patterns for various projects, historic texts, lots of good stuff in there. You can just outright purchase those resources if you wish, but if you join as a patron at any level, you get them for free. All of the paid levels get them equally free, regardless of which level you choose. So, if you're interested in wandering over there, we are most grateful. Now, I finished the carving, finished all of the engraving work, smoothing out, evening everything out, and painted it with a bit of this walnut stain that we made in a previous video. This is really pretty sticky stuff. It adheres really well, but the sweat from your finger will make it feel sticky. There's quite a bit of sugar in the walnut hulls, so when you cook it down to a syrup, that kind of acts as a binder, albeit a temporary one. But that's good, because what we want to do is we want the white bone accented and with the high contrast accent with the dark brown residual that will stay in the grooves after we wipe this clean. So we just have a Mr. Paper Towel and a little bit of water right there with the paper towel, and then we're just going to scrub and clean off all of the extra walnut goop. And you can see it wipes off very well, except for the grooves, and it really accentuates that pattern. Now, how much you leave in versus how much you wipe off, that is a choice. you get to make that choice on your own projects. You can see how much we're getting off there. Dip another little bit, another little area. So if it's a little too dark, you can just wipe it a little bit more. And if you wipe too much off, well, guess what? Put more on. You're not going to hurt or permanently deface anything here, no matter what you do. Okay? But it has a nice antiquing effect, and it accents all of your cutouts very, very nicely. Okay? Now, once we're done this, we are going to polish up the flats with a little rub down of steel wool. You can see as we do this, we're removing just the slightest bit of that bone dust and bringing the whites back up. Okay? So you're going to have 3 shades with this. The walnut does actually stain the bone. Okay? It penetrates and the dark colors adhere to the protein. Remember, bone is a mineral, which calcium phosphate, right, which is beta hydroxyapatite is the scientific name for the mineral, in combination with gelatin, right? Collagen, which breaks down into gelatin when you cook it. So the tannins in the walnut dye will permanently adhere to those proteins. Okay? So you're going to have a dark brown deep in the grooves. You're going to have a light brown where I'm not hitting with the steel wool, and you're going to have white where I'm polishing off the stained surface. Okay? So I'm going to finish this up, and when it is exactly as I want it, I'm going to come back and I'm going to coat it with a little bit of linseed oil just to seal it, because again, remember, this stuff is water soluble and a little sticky, right? So I don't want this to keep changing every time I get the piece wet. Okay, so when it's exactly as I want it, I will coat it with a little bit of linseed oil, let the bone soak up however much it wants. Linseed oil cut with a little bit of turpentine, that helps it penetrate. Okay, so let the bone soak up as much of that mixture as it wants, and then a day later, wipe it dry and let it harden. And I will show you the final result when all of that is done. You'll be able to see all of these marks a lot more clearly now with the ink on them and everything being finished off. One thing that happens when you steel wool or sand or make some dust, it wants to stick to the ink and it looks kind of white and foggy. But bone, when it's saturated with oil, becomes more of a translucent. So after putting the linseed oil on here, it has darkened all of those lines up. So you can see everything really, really nice. The paws popped out quite nicely there in the front. And then here in the back, that webbing came out really nice. I'm quite happy with how this worked. So the one thing I will say is there's one tool in this set that I want to remake. Not because the one that I made is bad, but when I made this tool, I made it with the idea of it being a stippling tool so that your finger can go in that crotch and stipple, and to be a little bit above the work so that you can see where you're tapping it, okay, for stippling and scrimshaw work. But when I went to use this, when I tried to hold it out here, it was uncomfortable and I ended up choking up all the way to the point. but then I'm holding it there on that little narrow blade, and that's not the most comfortable. So I'm going to make, this is beautiful for a stippling tool, it's perfect, I love it, but I'm going to make another one that only leaves about yay much of the point sticking out for an actual scribe. So that is one thing I wanted to note here. If you're working on this and making your own tools, that's a little point of advice in how to design them, depending on what purpose you want to put the tool to. But these worked quite nicely, and I'm quite happy with how it came out. So I hope that you will be encouraged to take on projects like this. It's not hard to make your own tools. It's not hard to do really nice work, even in difficult materials. It does take some time and it does take some practice, but you can do it. And I hope that you will try. I hope that you will keep engaging and learning these sorts of skills. And I hope that you'll join us here next time at Old Ways Rising Farm.